Sometimes the deepest wounds come not from enemies, but from the one person who promised to love you forever. When you realize that the life you've built together has slowly drained the joy from your soul, even eternal love can feel like a prison. Lady Celeste has stood beside Lord Aldric for 300 years. Once mortal lovers, they became vampires together. She was his companion through centuries of battles and darkness. But now, in their stone castle, something has changed in her heart. The endless nights of fighting and his hunger for power have worn her down. When she speaks the words that will end their bond forever, Aldric freezes. He has conquered kingdoms without fear, but now faces something he cannot defeat. For the first time, the most powerful vampire alive meets something stronger than his will. But what finally breaks an immortal marriage? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver ring caught the pale moonlight filtering through the tall windows of Ravencrest, keep its ancient runes glowing with a faint blue luminescence that had not dimmed in 3 centuries. Lady Celeste turned the wedding ring of eternal binding slowly around her finger, feeling the weight of the vows inscribed in the old tongue, promises that had once filled her heart with joy, but now felt like chains wrapping tighter with each passing decade. The Chronicle of Shadows lay open before her on the mahogany desk, its leather binding cracked and worn from countless readings. Page after yellowed page documented their transformation from mortal nobility to the undead rulers of the Northern Realm. Her own handwriting, precise and elegant, recorded the night. Everything changed. The night Lord Aldric of Thornwick and Lady Celeste of Rosehaven chose eternity over death, power over peace. She had been 26 when mortality slipped away like mist before dawn. Beautiful, they said, with hair like spun gold and eyes the color of summer sky. Aldric had been 31, a warrior lord whose reputation preceded him into every court and battlefield. Their love had been the stuff of troubadour songs, passionate, devoted, unshakable. When plague swept through their lands, taking their 2 young children in the span of a fortnight, they had clung to each other in grief so profound it threatened to swallow them whole. The vampire who found them in their despair had offered salvation, not from death, but from the pain of living with such loss. Immortality, he promised, would give them time to heal, time to love, time to build something greater than what they had lost. In their anguish, it had seemed like a blessing from the gods themselves. Now, 300 years later, Celeste understood that some wounds were meant to heal and some grief was meant to pass. The immortality they had chosen to escape, pain had instead frozen them in that moment of anguish, preserving it like a flower pressed between pages of an old book. The castle around her reflected the centuries of their reign. Ravencrest, keep perched on a jagged cliff overlooking the northern reaches, its black stone towers cutting sharp silhouettes against the perpetually overcast sky. Tapestries depicting their victories adorned the walls, the Battle of Ironhold, the Siege of Greenvale, the War of the Crimson Crown. Each triumph had added to their legend, their territory, their power. Below in the Great Hall, their court continued its nightly rituals. Vampire nobles from across the realm came to pay homage, seeking favor or delivering reports from distant holdings. Marcus Blackthorn, Aldric's most trusted lieutenant, would be there as always, his dark eyes observing, calculating, ever loyal to his lord. The mortal servants moved through their duties with the careful reverence of those who understood exactly what manner of beings they served. Celeste could hear Aldric's voice carrying up from the hall, rich and commanding as he held court. Once, that voice had been her anchor in storms of doubt or sorrow. Now, it reminded her only of how far they had drifted from the people they had been, how far she had drifted from herself. She closed the chronicle and moved to the window, looking out over the lands they ruled, peaceful now, for the most part. The wars that had consumed the first 2 centuries of their immortal existence had finally ended. The neighboring kingdoms either served them or feared them enough to keep their distance. Trade flowed along protected roads. The people prospered under their firm but fair rule. It should have been everything they had fought for. Instead, Celeste felt hollow, like a beautiful vase with nothing inside but echoes. The irony was not lost on her. In their mortal lives, peace had always been the goal, an end to the constant conflicts that plagued the noble houses, safety for their people, time to enjoy the simple pleasures of life. Now that they had achieved that peace through strength and fear, she found herself yearning for something else entirely, not the chaos of war, but the possibility of genuine rest. A soft knock at the chamber door interrupted her reverie. "Enter," she called, though she already knew who it would be. Elena, her lady's maid for the past 40 years, stepped inside with a curtsy. The woman was mortal still, though advanced in years, her once dark hair now silver, and her face lined with age. She had served faithfully, asking no questions about the nature of her mistresses, content with the generous compensation and protection that came with her position. "My lady, Lord Aldric requests your presence in the war room," Elena said, her voice carefully neutral. Celeste felt something cold settle in her chest. "The war room? Whatever for? We are at peace." "I could not say, my lady." He seemed quite excited about something. Maps spread across the great table. Marcus and the other lords gathered around. Of course, even in peace, Aldric's mind turned to expansion, to conquest, to the acquisition of more power. It was his nature, as fundamental to him as breathing had once been. She had loved that strength in him once, the way he could take charge of any situation, turn defeat into victory through sheer force of will. Now it exhausted her. "Tell my lord that I will join him shortly," Celeste said, turning back to the window. She heard Elena's retreating footsteps, then silence. The truth was, she no longer wanted to be part of his plans. The endless strategizing, the careful political maneuvering, the constant vigilance required to maintain their position, it all felt like a performance she had grown tired of giving. She wanted to tend a garden, to read poetry, to watch the sunrise without calculating how it might affect their enemies. She wanted to be human again. The thought should have horrified her. For 2 centuries, she had embraced their vampiric nature, reveled in the strength and speed and near invulnerability it provided. She had fought beside Aldric with fangs bared and blood on her hands, protecting what they had built together. But somewhere along the way, the cost had begun to outweigh the benefits. They could not have children, their vampiric nature precluded it. They could not grow old together, watching wisdom lines deepen around each other's eyes. They could not even die together when their time came, as their mortal selves had planned to do. They were frozen in this moment, this castle, this existence, for all eternity, unless one of them chose otherwise. Celeste had touched the wedding ring again, remembering the night Aldric had placed it on her finger. Not the vampiric ceremony that had bound them in undeath, but their original wedding, when they were young and mortal and full of dreams about the life they would build together. She had worn a gown of white silk, and he had looked so handsome in his ceremonial armor, and they had promised to love and honor and cherish until death parted them. Death had not parted them, but perhaps something else would. The thought frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. For the first time in decades, she felt something stir in her chest that might have been hope. Below, she could hear Aldric's laughter echoing up from the war room, rich with anticipation. He was planning something, some new campaign or conquest that would add to their legend. And he expected her to stand beside him, as she always had, supporting his vision with her own strength and wisdom. But what if she didn't? What if, for once, she chose her own path? The possibility hung in the air like morning mist, fragile and beautiful and terrifying. Celeste stood at the window for a long time, watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, thinking about choices and consequences and the weight of centuries. Somewhere in the distance, The bells of St. Mercy's monastery chimed the midnight hour. The sound carried on the wind like a whisper of old promises, old hopes that had never quite died despite 300 years of careful burial. Perhaps it was time to remember who she had been before the fangs and the throne and the endless, grinding machinery of immortal power. Perhaps it was time to choose. The crimson chalice sat forgotten on a dusty shelf in the war room, its ruby-red surface dulled by neglect. Once, it had held the sacred blood that sealed their transformation, the vessel through which they had drunk deeply of eternal life. Now it served as little more than decoration, gathering dust like so many other artifacts of their shared past. Celeste found Aldric exactly where she expected, bent over the great table, his dark hair falling across his forehead as he studied a collection of maps spread before him. Marcus stood at his right shoulder, as always, his scarred face impassive. 3 other vampire lords flanked the table, Lord Victor of the Eastern Marches, Lady Morwen of the Shadowlands, and Sir Garrett of Ironhold. All of them wore expressions of keen interest as Aldric traced roots across the parchment with his finger. "Ah, my beloved," Aldric said without looking up as she entered. "Perfect timing. Come, see what opportunities await us." Celeste approached slowly, her silk gown whispering against the stone floor. The maps showed territories she recognized, the southern kingdoms, peaceful lands that had never done them harm. Red marks indicated potential targets, cities, fortresses, trade routes. "Opportunities?" she asked, though she already suspected what she would hear. "The southern kingdoms grow complacent in their prosperity," Aldric explained, his voice warm with enthusiasm. "Their armies have grown soft, their defences lax. Lord Victor's spies report that King Edmund has dismissed half his standing forces to save coin for palace renovations." Victor nodded eagerly. "The border fortresses are undermanned, my lord. We could take 3 of them before they could mount any meaningful resistance." Celeste stared at the maps, feeling something cold settle in her stomach. "But we are at peace with the southern kingdoms. They pose no threat to us. Their trade benefits our own people." "Peace," Aldric said, finally looking up at her with eyes that gleamed like polished obsidian, "is merely the pause between victories, my dear. We cannot allow potential enemies to grow stronger while we grow complacent." "Potential enemies?" Celeste's voice carried a note of disbelief. "King Edmund sent wedding gifts when Lord Victor's daughter married last spring. His ambassadors dine at our table. What threat do they pose that justifies invasion?" The room fell silent. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his loyalty to Aldric warring with his respect for Celeste's judgment. The other lords exchanged glances, uncertain how to navigate this sudden tension between their rulers. Aldric straightened, his expression patient but firm. "You speak as if conquest were some brutal impulse, beloved. This is strategy. The southern kingdoms control the Amber Road, the richest trade route between the eastern ports and the western reaches. Under our rule, that wealth would flow through our lands instead of theirs." "We have wealth enough," Celeste said quietly. "Our people prosper. Our treasury overflows. What more do we need?" "Security," Aldric replied immediately. "Influence. The strength to protect what we have built. Surely you have not forgotten the lessons of our early years, how many enemies sought to destroy us when they thought us weak." Celeste remembered those years well. The desperate battles, the constant vigilance, the way Aldric had fought like a man possessed to carve out their domain. She had admired his strength then, his refusal to bow to those who would see them destroyed. But that was different. They had been fighting for survival, not expansion. "Those enemies are long dead or subjugated," she pointed out. "We face no immediate threats. This campaign you propose would make us the aggressors. It would make us victorious," Aldric corrected, his tone growing cooler. "I do not understand this reluctance, Celeste. You fought beside me to take the northern reaches. Your strategies helped us claim the borderlands. Your sword carved our path through the rebellion of the Seven Houses. Why do you suddenly question the necessity of maintaining our strength? Because I am tired, she thought but did not say. Because I no longer see the point in accumulating power for its own sake. Because somewhere in 3 centuries of endless conflict, I lost sight of what we were fighting for. Instead, she said, perhaps because I have seen enough of war to value peace when we achieve it. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Celeste saw something flicker in Aldric's eyes, surprise, disappointment, and beneath it all, a flash of anger quickly suppressed. Peace, he said slowly, is a luxury we maintain through strength. The moment we appear weak, every ambitious lord and petty king will see opportunity. Would you have us wait for them to strike first? I would have us enjoy what we have built, instead of constantly seeking to build more. Marcus cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps, my lord, my lady, this discussion might be better continued in private? Aldric's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. Indeed. Lords and lady, we will reconvene tomorrow evening. Consider the plans carefully. The assembled nobles filed out, leaving Celeste and Aldric alone with the maps and the forgotten chalice. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. I do not recognize the woman standing before me, Aldric said finally, his voice soft but laced with disappointment. The Celeste I married would never counsel weakness in the face of opportunity. The Finchen Celeste you married was mortal, she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. She lived in a world where time mattered, where choices had weight because life was finite. That woman is gone, Aldric. We both are. He moved around the table toward her, his movements fluid with predatory grace. We are more than we ever were as mortals, stronger, wiser, eternal. We have built an empire that will last forever. Forever is a very long time, Celeste said, backing away from his approach. Long enough to forget why we wanted an empire in the first place. We wanted security for our people, prosperity for our lands, a legacy that would outlive the brief span of mortal existence. Did we? Or did we want those things because we were too broken by grief to imagine any other path? Aldric stopped moving, his face going very still. You speak of grief as if it were weakness. Our children's deaths taught us that mortality is the true enemy, not the southern kingdoms, not ambitious rivals, but the fragility of everything we hold dear. Immortality freed us from that vulnerability. Immortality preserved our pain, Celeste said, the words torn from somewhere deep in her chest. It stopped us from healing, from growing, from becoming anything other than what we were in that moment of loss. We are not stronger than our mortal selves, Aldric. We are their shadows, frozen in time. His eyes flashed with genuine anger now. How dare you diminish what we have accomplished? Look around you, this castle, these lands, the thousands who live under our protection. We built this from nothing but our own will and strength. We built it from blood and fear, Celeste replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. And now you want to spill more blood for no reason other than the distant possibility of future threat. When does it end, Aldric? When we rule the entire world, when every king and queen bows before us? Or do we simply expand until there is nothing left to conquer but each other? The question seemed to strike him like a physical blow. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his features, the first crack in his absolute certainty that she had seen in decades. Then his expression hardened again, familiar arrogance sliding back into place like armor. You are overwrought, he said dismissively. Take time to consider what we have discussed. You will see reason. The casual dismissal of her concerns, the assumption that she would simply fall in line as she always had, sparked something dangerous in Celeste's chest. For 3 centuries, she had been his perfect partner, his willing accomplice in building their dark empire. But she was tired of being perfect, tired of being willing. tired of being anything other than herself. "What if I don't?" she asked quietly. Aldric blinked, clearly not expecting the question. What? What if I don't see reason? What if I refuse to support this campaign? What if I tell you that I will no longer be party to conquest for its own sake? His laugh was sharp, disbelieving. "You cannot be serious. I have never been more serious about anything in 300 years. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, charged with the weight of something fundamental shifting between them. Aldric stared at her as if seeing a stranger wearing his wife's face. "You would defy me," he said slowly. "You would undermine our rule, weaken our position, all for what? Sentiment, squeamishness about necessary action." "I would choose peace over power," Celeste replied. "I would choose healing over hatred. I would choose to remember who we were before grief and immortality twisted us into something we never meant to become." Aldric's hands curled into fists at his sides. "You speak as if our nature were a disease to be cured rather than a gift to be treasured." "Perhaps it is both," she said softly. And with those words, spoken into the dusty silence of the war room beneath the unseeing gaze of the forgotten chalice, the first real crack appeared in 3 centuries of perfect unity. The bronze monastery bell rang out across the valley as dawn broke over the distant mountains, its deep, resonant tone carrying on the morning wind like a prayer made manifest. Celeste had ridden through the night to reach St. Mercy's, needing distance from the castle and the weight of Aldric's expectations. The ancient bell's call to morning prayers had once been the rhythm of her mortal life, marking the hours with gentle certainty rather than the endless, undifferentiated darkness of immortal nights. Brother Thomas met her at the monastery gates, his weathered face creased with concern. The aging abbot had known her for decades, though he believed her to be the descendant of a long line of noble patrons rather than the same woman who had first sought refuge here 2 centuries ago. The deception was necessary. Mortals aged and died while she remained unchanged, forcing her to occasionally reinvent herself to maintain the illusion of mortality when dealing with the outside world. "Lady Celeste," he said, bowing slightly, "you are welcome. As always, though you seem troubled this morning." She dismounted her black mare, grateful for the simple courtesy in his manner. Here, she was not the vampire queen of the northern reaches, feared and revered in equal measure. Here, she was simply another soul seeking solace. "May I walk in your gardens, Father? I find myself in need of peace." "Of course, my child. The morning glory blooms are particularly beautiful this time of year." The monastery gardens stretched behind the main buildings, terraced into the hillside in neat rows of herbs, vegetables, and flowers. Celeste had always found comfort here among growing things, plants that lived and died according to natural law rather than supernatural preservation. She knelt beside a patch of morning glories, their trumpet-shaped blooms opening to greet the sun with simple trust. Once, she had tended gardens like this in her mortal life. Lady Celeste of Rosehaven had been known for her skill with healing herbs, her ability to coax life from even the most stubborn soil. She had planned elaborate gardens for the castle she would share with Aldric, dreaming of the flowers their children would play among. The memory struck her with unexpected force. Not the sharp agony that such recollections usually brought, but something softer, a gentle melancholy touched with acceptance. For the first time in 3 centuries, she could think of her lost babies without the overwhelming urge to flee from the pain. "You seem far away in your thoughts," Brother Thomas observed, settling beside her on the garden path, despite his advanced age. "I was remembering," she said simply. "Sometimes the past feels more real than the present." "The past has weight," he agreed, "but it should not be a cage. Even the deepest grief can become a teacher rather than a tormentor, given time and grace." Time. Such a strange concept when viewed through immortal eyes. For mortals, time was precious because it was limited. Each moment carried significance because there would not be infinite moments to follow. For vampires, time was both blessing and curse. Endless opportunity, but also endless stagnation. Father, do you believe it possible for someone to change their essential nature, to become something other than what they have always been? The old priest considered this carefully. I believe the soul is capable of growth at any stage of existence. The question is whether one has the courage to embrace that growth, even when it means leaving familiar patterns behind. Familiar patterns, like standing beside Aldric as he planned conquest after conquest, supporting his vision because it was easier than questioning her own desires. Like playing the role of perfect partner in their immortal dance of power and control. What if that growth meant disappointing those we love, abandoning responsibilities we have carried for a very long time? Ah, Brother Thomas smiled. You speak of the burden many women carry, the belief that their worth lies in serving others' dreams rather than pursuing their own. Tell me, child, what would you choose if you could set down every expectation save those of your own heart? The question hung in the morning air like the monastery bell's resonance. What would she choose? Not conquest or power or the accumulation of wealth and territory. Not the endless vigilance required to maintain their position through strength and fear. She would choose the sunrise, the simple pleasure of watching morning break over the mountains without calculating military advantages or political implications. She would choose to tend growing things, to read poetry, to sit quietly with her own thoughts without the constant noise of court intrigue and strategic planning. She would choose peace, not the temporary absence of war that Aldric called peace, but genuine tranquility of soul. I would choose differently, she admitted softly, but such choices carry consequences far beyond myself. The most important choices usually do, Brother Thomas said, rising stiffly to his feet. I will leave you to your contemplation, but remember, even God grants his children free will. How much more should we grant ourselves permission to grow? Celeste remained in the gardens long after the abbot had gone, watching the sun climb higher over the valley. Somewhere beyond the mountains, Aldric would be rising from his daily rest, perhaps wondering at her absence. By now, Marcus would have informed him that she had ridden out during the night without escort or explanation. Such behavior was unlike her, the perfect vampire queen who always informed her lord of her intentions. But she was tired of being perfect. The realization struck her with crystalline clarity. For 3 centuries, she had molded herself to fit Aldric's vision of the ideal partner. Strong when he needed strength, wise when he sought counsel, ruthless when their enemies required elimination. She had been everything he needed, and nothing he didn't want. When had she stopped being herself? The answer came with uncomfortable honesty. She had never been herself, not as an immortal. From the moment they rose as vampires, she had defined herself in relation to him, his queen, his partner, his complement. Their shared trauma had fused them together so completely that she had lost track of where his desires ended and hers began. The morning glories reached toward the sun with unconscious grace, following their nature without question or apology. They did not seek permission to bloom or justify their existence through service to others. They simply were, completely and authentically themselves. Perhaps it was time she learned to do the same. The ride back to Ravencrest took most of the day, giving her ample time to think. The countryside rolled past in familiar patterns, villages where their people went about their daily lives, fields where crops grew under the protection of their rule, roads kept safe by their strength. It was a good life for those under their protection, prosperous, secure. But goodness achieved through fear was still built on an unstable foundation. Eventually, someone would challenge them, some ambitious lord or foreign power would test their strength, and Aldric would meet that challenge with overwhelming force, as he always had, adding another conquest to their collection. The cycle would continue forever unless someone chose to break it. As the castle's towers came into view against the evening sky, Celeste felt something settle in her chest, like the toll of a distant bell. Change was coming, whether Aldric recognized it or not. She could no longer pretend that his dreams were hers, that his vision of their future filled her with anything but weary resignation. For the first time in centuries, she had her own vision, a small, quiet thing involving gardens and sunrise, and the freedom to simply exist without justification. The only question now was whether she had the courage to pursue it. The map of conquered realms dominated the eastern wall of Aldric's private study, its massive scope a testament to 3 centuries of relentless expansion. Each territory was marked in gold ink with the date of conquest, forming an impressive patchwork that stretched from the frozen wastes in the north to the amber shores in the south. Red pins marked potential future acquisitions, while blue marked allied territories. The southern kingdoms bore fresh red pins, their borders traced with Aldric's own hand. Celeste stood before the map when Aldric found her the next evening, her fingers tracing the borders of their original domain, a small holding in the Central Highlands that had been her mortal father's legacy. Everything else had been added through conquest, diplomacy, or simple intimidation. The sheer scope of their empire should have filled her with pride. Instead, she felt only exhaustion. "You returned late," Aldric said, closing the study door behind him. His tone was carefully neutral, but she heard the underlying tension. "I needed time to think," she replied, not turning from the map. "And what conclusions did your thinking reach?" Now she did turn, meeting his dark gaze steadily. "That perhaps we have enough." Aldric moved to his desk, pouring wine from a crystal decanter that had once belonged to a conquered king. The irony was not lost on either of them. Their entire castle was a museum of other people's defeats. "Enough is a dangerous word for rulers," he said, offering her a goblet. "Our enemies will never believe we have enough. They will always assume we hunger for more, will always plan accordingly. In such circumstances, having enough becomes having too little." Celeste accepted the wine but did not drink. "What enemies, Aldric? Name them. Point to them on your precious map and tell me which of our neighbors poses sufficient threat to justify another campaign." "Threat is not always immediate," he said, settling into his chair with the fluid grace that marked all their movements. "The southern kingdoms grow wealthy while we focus on consolidating our existing holdings. Wealth becomes armies. Armies become ambitions. King Edmund has shown us nothing but courtesy. His daughter was fostered at our court for 3 years. His youngest son serves in Marcus's honor guard. Political theater," Aldric dismissed. "A wise ruler maintains friendly relations while building strength. You think too well of human nature, beloved, and you think too poorly of it." The words hung between them, carrying more weight than she had intended. Aldric set down his wine, his expression growing serious. "I think realistically of it," he corrected. "I have seen what humans do when they believe themselves strong enough to challenge us. The rebellion of 7 houses, the merchant war, the border conflicts. Each time, we showed mercy first and were forced to show strength later. Those conflicts ended decades ago. The children who lead the southern kingdoms now have known nothing but peace with us. Peace bought with their parents' fear of our strength. Remove that fear, and we will see how quickly they remember their ambitions." Celeste moved to the window, looking out over the courtyard, where their guards maintained their nightly patrols. Mortal soldiers mostly, bound to them by oaths of loyalty and generous pay. They served willingly because service to Ravencrest meant prosperity and protection. It was a good arrangement, built on mutual benefit rather than pure domination. "You speak as if war were inevitable," she said, "as if peace could never be anything more than a temporary truce." "For creatures like us, it cannot be," Aldric replied. "We are apex predators, Celeste. Wolves may choose not to hunt for a day or a week, but they remain wolves. Their nature does not change because they feel momentarily satisfied. Perhaps their nature changes when they no longer hunger. Vampires always hunger. The certainty in his voice sparked. Irritation in her chest. For blood, perhaps. But why must we always hunger for conquest? Aldric rose from his chair, moving to stand behind her at the window. His hands settled on her shoulders, familiar and possessive. Because conquest is survival, he said softly. Every territory we control is territory that cannot be used against us. Every potential enemy we subjugate is one that cannot threaten what we have built. You speak of peace as if it were an end state, but peace is merely the pause between one conflict and the next. It doesn't have to be. For mortals, perhaps not. But we are not mortals anymore, beloved. We cannot grow old and die, leaving our empire to children who might choose differently. We must secure our position for eternity or watch everything we have built crumble when the next generation of ambitious lords decides to test our resolve. Celeste pulled away from his touch, turning to face him. And when we have conquered everything, when there are no more ambitious lords to worry about, what then, Aldric? Do we turn on each other? Do we seek new worlds to dominate? We maintain what we have built, he said, as if the answer were obvious. We rule justly, but firmly. We ensure that our people prosper under our protection. Forever, forever. The single word carried the weight of eternity, settling over them like a shroud. Celeste felt something inside her recoil from that vast, unchanging future, centuries upon centuries of the same conversations, the same struggles for dominance, the same careful balance of fear and respect that kept their empire stable. I used to dream, she said quietly. When I was mortal, I would dream of the future growing old with you, watching our children become adults, perhaps even seeing grandchildren. Small dreams, domestic dreams. I was content with such a modest scope. Those dreams died with our mortality, Aldric said, his voice growing sharper. You cannot mourn them forever. I'm not mourning them. I'm remembering what it felt like to want something beyond power and control. What else is there for creatures like us? What grand ambition could possibly replace the satisfaction of building something lasting? Celeste looked at him, really looked, taking in the angular beauty of his features, the intelligence in his dark eyes, the controlled strength in every movement. He was magnificent, she realized. A perfect apex predator, just as he claimed. But perfection could be its own kind of prison. Peace, she said finally, not the absence of immediate threats, but genuine tranquility. The ability to exist without constantly planning the next move in an infinite game. Tranquility is stagnation. Perhaps, or perhaps it's growth of a different kind. Aldric studied her face, as if looking for signs of madness. You speak as if you would abandon everything we have built for some mystical state of contentment that may not even exist. I speak as if I would choose what makes me happy over what makes me powerful. Power is what keeps you alive to pursue happiness. What if power is what prevents me from finding it? The question struck him like a physical blow. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his features, the first crack in his absolute conviction that she had seen in years. Then his expression hardened, familiar arrogance sliding back into place. You are overwrought, he said dismissively. Perhaps you should rest. Tomorrow evening we will discuss the Southern campaign properly, when you are thinking more clearly. The casual assumption that her disagreement stemmed from temporary weakness rather than genuine conviction sparked something dangerous in Celeste's chest. 3 centuries of being the perfect partner, and this was how he responded to the first hint of independent thought. I am thinking more clearly than I have in decades, she said quietly. But Aldric had already turned back to his maps, dismissing her concerns with the confidence of someone who had never truly doubted his own judgment. Celeste left him there, surrounded by his conquered territories and his grand ambitions, planning wars that served no purpose save the perpetuation of their eternal dominance. For the first time, she began to understand that their fundamental disagreement was not about the southern kingdoms at all. It was about what they had become and what she no longer wished to be. The portrait of their mortal selves hung in an alcove of Celeste's private chambers, hidden behind a tapestry that she rarely drew back anymore. Tonight, however, she found herself standing before the painted images of who they had been 3 centuries ago, young, hopeful, gloriously alive. The artist had captured them in their wedding finery. Aldric resplendent in ceremonial armor, his face open with joy and anticipation, herself in flowing white silk, a crown of summer flowers adorning hair that caught the light like spun gold. They looked so innocent, so blissfully unaware of what they would become. The mortal Celeste in the portrait held a single white rose, symbol of new love and pure intentions. Her painted eyes sparkled with dreams of the life she would build, with her beloved children playing in castle gardens, quiet evenings by the fire, growing old together in contentment and peace. Simple dreams for simple people who believed happiness could be found in love and family rather than conquest and dominion. Those people were as dead as if they had been buried in consecrated ground. Celeste had taken to spending her evenings here in her chambers, rather than attending court or participating in Aldric's strategic discussions. Let the vampire lords whisper about her absence. Let Marcus field their questions with diplomatic non-answers. She was tired of performing the role of perfect queen for an audience that would never understand her growing discontent. Instead, she read poetry by candlelight, verses written by mortals who understood the bittersweet nature of finite existence. She tended a small herb garden on her chamber's balcony, coaxing life from ordinary soil with gentle care rather than supernatural compulsion. She practiced embroidery, letting her hands remember skills that had no strategic value, no political significance, no purpose beyond the simple pleasure of creating something beautiful. These small acts of rebellion felt more significant than any battle she had ever fought. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. "Enter," she called, though she hoped it would not be Aldric. She was not ready for another debate about the necessity of conquest. To her relief, it was Elena who entered, carrying a silver tray laden with delicacies from the castle's kitchen. The elderly woman had served faithfully for decades, asking no questions about her mistress's supernatural nature, but showing the kind of loyal devotion that came from genuine affection rather than fear. "I thought you might be hungry, my lady," Elena said, setting the tray on a small table near the window. "You missed the evening meal again." "Thank you," Celeste said, though food held little appeal. Vampires required blood for true sustenance, but they could still taste and enjoy mortal fare, one of the few pleasures that remained from their human existence. Elena hesitated, her weathered hands smoothing her apron. "If I may say so, my lady, you seem melancholy of late. Is there anything I might do to ease your spirits?" The kindness in her voice nearly brought tears to Celeste's eyes. When had she last received such simple, uncomplicated care? When had anyone asked what she needed rather than what she could provide? "Tell me about your granddaughter," Celeste said, instead of answering directly. "Little Mary. How does she fare?" Elena's face brightened immediately. "Oh, she's a bright one, my lady, already reading at 7 years old, and with such curiosity about everything. Just yesterday she asked me why the stars move across the sky each night. And what did you tell her?" "The truth that I don't know, but perhaps she'll be the one to discover the answer someday." Celeste smiled at that. A wise response. To admit ignorance while encouraging wonder. "Children need to believe the world holds mysteries worth solving," Elena said. "Otherwise, what's the point of growing up?" The innocent observation struck Celeste with unexpected force. What mysteries remained in her immortal existence? What wonders awaited discovery when one had already seen centuries pass? She had accumulated knowledge and power and influence, but when had she last felt genuine curiosity about anything beyond the next military campaign or political maneuver? "Elena," she said slowly, "do you think it possible for someone to become a different person entirely? To leave behind everything they have been and start anew?" The older woman considered this seriously. "I think people change all the time, my lady. My late husband was a wild young man when I married him, always looking for his next adventure, never content to stay in one place. But when our children were born, he became the most devoted father you could imagine. Same man, but he chose to become something different. But what if the change required leaving behind everything you had built together, everything you shared?" Elena's expression grew gentle with understanding. "Then I suppose it would depend on whether staying true to yourself was worth the cost. Some changes are worth any price, my lady, even the highest one." After Elena left, Celeste found herself unable to focus on reading or gardening. Instead, she walked the familiar corridors of Ravencrest, seeing them as if for the first time. Every tapestry told a story of conquest. Every trophy spoke of defeated enemies. Every architectural detail proclaimed the power and permanence of their dynasty. It was impressive, magnificent even, but it was not home, not in the way her mortal childhood home had been, with its comfortable disorder and lived-in warmth. This castle was a monument to their immortal achievements, but monuments were for the dead. She found Aldric in the great hall, holding court as he did most evenings. He sat on his throne, their throne, technically, though she noticed he no longer waited for her before beginning proceedings. The message was clear. Her absence was noted but not essential. The machinery of their empire functioned perfectly well without her input. A delegation of merchants sought permission to establish new trade routes through their territory. Marcus reported on patrol activities along their borders. Lord Victor presented intelligence about potential unrest in the eastern marches. All routine business, the sort of administrative details that kept their realm functioning smoothly. Aldric handled each matter with practiced efficiency, his decisions fair but firm. He was, she admitted, an excellent ruler, better than most mortal kings she had known. His combination of strength and wisdom had brought prosperity to lands that had known only conflict before their reign. Their people lived better lives under vampire rule than they had under the petty squabbling of mortal nobles. But excellence in ruling did not necessarily translate to excellence in other areas of life. A man could be a great king and a poor husband. A woman could serve her realm faithfully while losing herself in the process. As if sensing her presence, Aldric looked up from the supplicant currently presenting his case. Their eyes met across the length of the great hall, and for a moment she saw something that might have been relief or invitation in his gaze. He gestured subtly to the empty throne beside him, a wordless request for her to join him, to resume her place as his partner in all things. Celeste felt the pull of old habits, the familiar comfort of falling into established patterns. It would be so easy to walk down that long aisle, settle into her throne, and pretend that nothing had changed between them. To smile and nod and play the role of perfect queen, while something vital inside her continued to wither. Instead, she turned and walked away. Behind her, she heard the slight falter in Aldric's voice as he continued with the evening's business. The sound followed her through the corridors like an accusation, but she did not look back. In her chambers, she stood before the portrait again, studying the faces of the people they had been. Such hope in their expressions, such certainty that love would be enough to carry them through any hardship. Perhaps it would have been if they had remained mortal. Perhaps those two young people would have grown old together in happiness, their love deepening with each passing year rather than calcifying into habit and expectation. But those people were gone, and she was tired of pretending otherwise. For the first time in 3 centuries, Celeste began to seriously consider what it might mean to choose herself over everything else she had ever known. The sword of first blood rested in its place of honor above the great fireplace in Aldric's study, its blade gleaming with an otherworldly sheen that spoke of the supernatural violence it had witnessed. Forged in the early days of their vampiric existence, it had tasted the life force of Aldric's first victim as an immortal, a rival lord who had thought to challenge their nascent power. The weapon was more than steel and silver. It was a symbol of transformation, of the moment Aldric had fully embraced his nature as apex predator. Now, as he stood before it in the pre-dawn hours, Aldric found himself questioning everything he had built his identity upon. 3 weeks had passed since Celeste's withdrawal from court life, and her absence echoed through the castle like a wound that refused to heal. She attended no councils, participated in no strategic planning, offered no counsel on matters of state. When he sought her out for conversation, she was polite but distant, speaking to him as she might address any courtier rather than her partner of 3 centuries. The other vampire lords had begun to notice. Lord Victor had made careful inquiries about the Queen's health. Lady Morwyn had expressed concern about the stability of their rule if the royal couple appeared divided. Even Marcus, loyal Marcus who never questioned his decisions, had taken to watching him with worried eyes. "My lord?" The voice belonged to Thomas Hartwell, one of their mortal retainers who served as keeper of the castle's extensive library. The elderly scholar stood in the doorway, hesitant to interrupt, but clearly bearing important news. "What is it, Thomas?" "I thought you should know, my lord. Lady Celeste has been making unusual requests from the library. Books on philosophy, poetry, treatises on peaceful governance. And yesterday, she asked for maps of the surrounding monasteries and convents." Monasteries and convents. Aldric felt something cold settle in his chest. Such places offered sanctuary to those seeking to escape the world's complexities, mortals who had grown weary of earthly concerns and desired only spiritual contemplation. Did she say why she needed such information? Only that she was researching historical documents, my lord. But the specific texts she requested. Thomas hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with his role as informant. They were accounts written by nobles who had renounced their titles to enter religious life. After dismissing Thomas, Aldric found himself staring at the sword again, remembering the night he had first drawn blood as an immortal. The power he had felt, the absolute certainty that he was becoming something greater than human limitation could ever allow. Every victory since then had reinforced that conviction, every conquered territory, every defeated enemy, every expansion of their influence. But what if Celeste no longer shared that conviction? What if she viewed their immortal nature not as ascension, but as deviation from some truer path? The possibility terrified him more than any army ever had. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. Marcus entered at his invitation, his scarred face bearing the careful neutrality he wore when delivering unwelcome news. "The reports you requested," Marcus said, placing a leather portfolio on the desk. "Our agents in the southern kingdoms confirm that King Edmund continues his military reduction. 2 more border fortresses have been decommissioned. Their army is now less than half the strength it was 5 years ago, leaving them vulnerable to exactly the sort of campaign I proposed," Aldric said, though the words felt hollow. "Yes, my lord. The opportunity remains ideal for conquest." Marcus paused, then added carefully, "If that remains your intention." Aldric caught the subtle emphasis. "You have doubts?" "I have observations," Marcus replied. "The men have noticed the Queen's absence from strategic planning. They wonder if we are divided on this matter. Divided leadership makes soldiers nervous. And what do you tell them? That the Queen's wisdom balances your strength, and that no major decision would be made without her full support." Aldric turned from the sword to study his lieutenant's face. Marcus had served him faithfully since the early decades of their reign, rising through merit and loyalty to become his most trusted advisor. If anyone could speak honestly about the current situation, it would be him. "But you don't believe she will support this campaign," Aldric said. "I believe," Marcus said carefully, "that Lady Celeste has changed in ways that perhaps we have not fully recognized." Changed how? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his words. "When I first entered your service, my lord, the Queen was fierce. She gloried in battle as much as you did. Her strategies were brilliant, her resolve unshakable. She embraced our nature without reservation. And now she tends flowers on her balcony and reads poetry by candlelight. She asks the servants about their families, shows interest in their mortal concerns. Yesterday, I saw her in the castle's chapel, not conducting any ceremony, just sitting quietly among the empty pews." The chapel. Aldric had not set foot in that space for over a century. It had been built to serve their mortal retainers, a concession to human spiritual needs that he tolerated but did not understand. What could possibly draw Celeste to such a place? "She seeks peace," he said, the words bitter on his tongue. "Perhaps, or perhaps she seeks something we cannot provide." Marcus hesitated, then continued. "My lord, may I speak frankly?" Aldric nodded. "In my observation, the greatest threat to any ruler is not external conquest but internal decay. When the foundation of leadership begins to crumble, everything built upon it becomes vulnerable. If the Queen has truly withdrawn her support from your vision—" He let the sentence hang unfinished. "What would you counsel?" "Compromise. Find common ground. Discover what she needs that you have not provided. And if what she needs is for me to become something other than what I am?" Marcus met his gaze steadily. "Then you must decide whether keeping her is worth changing yourself or whether your nature is worth losing her." After Marcus left, Aldric remained in his study, staring at the sword that had defined so much of his immortal existence. For 3 centuries he had wielded it in service of a simple philosophy: strength guaranteed survival, and survival justified any action necessary to maintain that strength. But what if strength could not solve every problem? What if there were challenges that required surrender rather than conquest? The thought was antithetical to everything he believed, yet he could not dismiss it. Celeste's growing distance was proof that some battles could not be won through force of will or superior strategy. Some opponents, particularly when that opponent was the person you loved most, required entirely different approaches. For the first time since becoming immortal, Aldric found himself truly uncertain about the path forward. Every instinct screamed that showing weakness or doubt would invite disaster, but continuing on his current course seemed equally likely to destroy what mattered most to him. The irony was not lost on him. He had conquered kingdoms and commanded armies, faced down rebellions and crushed his enemies without hesitation. Yet one mortal woman's gentle withdrawal from their shared life had left him more confused and desperate than any military campaign ever had. Perhaps this was what mortals meant when they spoke of love as both blessing and curse. It gave life meaning but also created vulnerabilities that no amount of power could protect against. As dawn approached and he prepared to seek his daily rest, Aldric made a decision. He would try Marcus's advice, not from weakness, but from a different kind of strength. He would attempt to understand what Celeste needed, even if it meant questioning everything he had taken for granted about their immortal existence. But first, he needed to understand why she was researching monasteries and convents, and that conversation, he suspected, would test every assumption he had ever made about their eternal bond. The sword of first blood caught the dying light from the window, its blade reflecting his face back at him with pitiless clarity. For once, he did not see a conqueror or apex predator in that reflection. He saw a man who might be about to lose everything that truly mattered. The locket of human hair lay hidden beneath a loose stone in the floor of Celeste's chambers, wrapped in silk that had once been part of her daughter's christening gown. Aldric discovered it purely by accident, pursuing the source of a strange sound that had echoed from her room during the day's rest. What he found instead was a shrine to grief so profound it took his breath away. The locket contained 2 locks of hair, one golden like spun sunlight, the other dark as rich earth. Emma and William. Their mortal children who had died of plague 3 centuries ago, taken in the space of a fortnight when they were merely 6 and 4 years old. The hair was all that remained of them now, preserved by a mother's love long after their small bodies had turned to dust. But it was not just the locket. Arranged around the hidden alcove were other mementos, a wooden toy horse that William had carried everywhere, its paint worn smooth by tiny hands, a pressed flower from Emma's first garden, somehow maintained through supernatural preservation, a child's drawing of their family, 4 stick figures holding hands beneath a cheerfully crooked sun. Aldric sank to his knees before the shrine, understanding crashing over him like a tide of ice water. In all their centuries together, he had assumed Celeste's grief had healed, as his own had transformed into the driving purpose that had shaped their immortal existence. He had thought their shared pain had been channeled into building something greater, something that would ensure such loss could never touch them again. He had been catastrophically wrong. A soft footstep made him look up. Celeste stood in the doorway, her face pale but unsurprised. She had known this moment would come eventually. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Every night, for 300 years, she replied, moving to kneel beside him before the hidden shrine. "I come here and remember what we lost, what we abandoned when we chose immortality over healing." "You said you wanted to escape the pain. You said that," Celeste corrected gently. "You were in such agony, such rage at their deaths, that when the vampire offered us eternity, you saw it as salvation, and I loved you too much to let you face that eternity alone." The words struck him like physical blows. "You never wanted immortality. I wanted my children back. When that proved impossible, I wanted to heal from their loss, to grieve properly, and eventually find peace. But immortality froze us in that moment of trauma. We never healed because we never allowed ourselves to." Aldric stared at the tiny artifacts of their mortal life, pieces of a family that had been torn away by disease and time. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you needed to believe we had chosen correctly. Your pain was so immense, Aldric. You spoke of conquest and expansion as if building an empire could somehow justify our children's deaths, could make their loss meaningful through our great works. And it did," he said desperately. "Look what we've built together, the lives we've protected, the peace we've enforced." "Built on running away from grief," Celeste interrupted. "Every campaign you planned, every territory you conquered, every enemy you defeated, it was all to avoid sitting still long enough to feel what we lost." The accusation hung between them, terrible in its truth. Aldric thought of all the nights he had spent planning strategies, studying maps, always moving forward toward the next goal. He had told himself it was about building security, about protecting what they had. But perhaps it had simply been about avoiding the silence where memory lived. "The monastery," he said suddenly. "You want to go to a place where people heal from trauma, where they find peace through acceptance rather than conquest." Celeste nodded. "St. Mercy's has a tradition of welcoming those who carry great grief. They don't seek to cure it or overcome it. They help souls learn to live with loss in healthy ways. As a mortal, yes." The single word contained the weight of their entire relationship. Aldric felt something fundamental crack inside his chest, like ice breaking under the warmth of spring sun. "You would give up everything we are to become human again?" "I would give up everything we've become to remember what we were," she corrected. "Before the grief consumed us. Before we confused power with healing." Aldric looked around the hidden shrine, seeing it now for what it truly was, a mother's vigil for children who had been dead longer than they had ever been alive. 3 centuries of secret mourning, while he had charged forward into battle after battle, war after war, convincing himself that momentum was the same as progress. "I failed them," he said suddenly. "I failed to protect them from the plague. We both did. That's what parents do when children die. We blame ourselves for not being powerful enough to save them. So I became powerful enough to save everyone else. Yes, and in doing so, you made yourself into something our children would not recognize, something that cannot grieve properly because grief feels like weakness." The words cut deep because they were true. In his immortal existence, Aldric had indeed come to view any emotion that interfered with strategic thinking as a liability to be overcome. Grief was inefficient. Love made one vulnerable. Mercy created opportunities for enemies. He had become exactly the kind of ruler who would have been a threat to his mortal family. "The southern kingdoms," he said slowly. "You oppose the campaign not because you've grown soft, but because you recognize it as another attempt to avoid facing what we've lost. King Edmund's children are the same age as Emma and William would have been when they died," Celeste said quietly. "His daughter reminds me of Emma, curious, brave, always asking questions about everything. When I see her in our court, I remember what we're fighting to protect, and also what we've forgotten how to value." Aldric closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 3 centuries pressing down upon him. "What we've forgotten how to be. We were parents, Aldric. We were people who created life and nurtured it and found joy in simple domestic moments. We were lovers who dreamed of growing old together, watching our children become adults, perhaps holding grandchildren. Small dreams, human dreams. Mortal dreams. Dreams that ended when we chose to avoid grief rather than work through it. For a long time, they knelt together in the silence of the hidden shrine, surrounded by the remnants of a life they had shared for such a brief moment before immortality changed everything. Aldric found himself really looking at the artifacts for the first time, seeing not just reminders of loss, but evidence of love, proof that they had once been people capable of creating something beautiful together. "If you choose mortality," he said finally, "you'll grow old. You'll die, yes, and you would choose that over eternity with me." Celeste turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I would choose the possibility of peace over the certainty of endless, unhealed pain. I would choose the chance to grieve properly, to remember our children with joy rather than just anguish, to become someone they would have been proud to call their mother, even if it means leaving me behind, even if it means losing you forever." The confession broke something in Aldric that had been carefully constructed over 3 centuries of careful emotional control. For the first time since their transformation, he wept not the controlled grief of a strategic mind calculating loss, but the raw, overwhelming sorrow of a father who had lost his children and a husband who was losing his wife. Celeste held him as he cried, her own tears falling silently into his dark hair. Around them, the artifacts of their mortal family bore witness to this moment of truth, the recognition that some wounds could only heal through acceptance rather than conquest. When the storm of emotion finally passed, Aldric lifted his head to meet her gaze. "What if I came with you? What if we chose mortality together as we chose immortality? Could you do that?" she asked gently. "Could you give up power willingly? Could you face grief without trying to conquer it?" Aldric looked again at the shrine, at the evidence of love that had endured 3 centuries of deliberate forgetting. He thought of their children, who had loved him not for his strength or strategic brilliance, but simply for being their father. He thought of the man he had been in those brief, precious years before loss had transformed him into something harder and colder and infinitely more alone. "I don't know," he admitted, "but perhaps it's time I tried to find out." For the first time in months, Celeste smiled at him with something approaching the warmth he remembered from their mortal days. It was not an answer, but it was a beginning, and for now, that might be enough. The travel cloak of departure lay spread across Celeste's bed, its simple brown wool a stark contrast to the elaborate silks and velvets that filled her wardrobe. It had belonged to her mortal mother, worn during the long journey from her childhood home to Rosehaven when she married Aldric 3.5 centuries ago. Then it had represented new beginnings, the hope of building a life with the man she loved. Now it would carry her away from everything they had built together toward an uncertain but necessary future. Celeste folded the cloak carefully, her hands steady, despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. 3 days had passed since Aldric's discovery of her shrine, 3 days of careful conversations and painful honesty that had laid bare the fundamental differences in how they viewed their immortal existence. He had tried, genuinely tried, to understand her perspective. But understanding and accepting were different things entirely. A soft knock interrupted her preparations. "Enter," she called, expecting Elena with the evening meal she had requested. Instead, Aldric stepped into the chamber, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes betraying the turmoil beneath. He took in the scene before him, the travel pack, the simple clothes laid out for easy movement, the absence of all the jewelry and finery that marked her as vampire royalty. "When?" he asked simply. "Tomorrow night, after the moon sets and before dawn breaks. The monastery will accept you. Brother Thomas has sent word to the Mother Superior. They have a tradition of welcoming noble widows seeking spiritual peace." The lie came easily. She had crafted her story carefully to avoid complications. A noblewoman whose husband had died in foreign wars, seeking solace in religious contemplation rather than remarriage. Aldric moved to the window, looking out over the courtyard where their guards maintained their nightly patrols. "The castle will notice your absence quickly. Questions will be asked. I've prepared letters for Marcus and the household staff. They'll understand that I've chosen to seek spiritual retreat while you consider the southern campaign. A temporary separation to reflect on our differences. But you don't intend it to be temporary." "No." The honesty hung between them like a blade. Celeste continued her preparations, knowing that any hesitation now might weaken her resolve. She had spent 3 centuries subordinating her needs to their shared vision. This choice, perhaps the first truly independent choice she had made as an immortal, required absolute commitment. "The others have been asking about us," Aldric said. "Marcus grows increasingly concerned about the appearance of division. Lord Victor suggested that perhaps you are merely experiencing some form of supernatural melancholy that might be cured through renewed purpose." "And what did you tell them?" "And what did you tell them?" "That their concern was noted but unnecessary, that the Queen's wisdom would ultimately align with practical necessity, as it always had." Celeste paused in her folding. "You still believe I'll change my mind? I believe that you're making this decision from a place of pain rather than clear reasoning. The monastery may offer temporary comfort, but it cannot change what we are. Eventually, you'll realize that immortality requires immortal solutions, not mortal ones." She turned to face him fully. "And if I don't? If I find the peace I'm seeking there? If I choose to remain mortal for whatever years I have left?" Aldric's jaw tightened. "Then you would be choosing death over life with me. I would be choosing authentic existence over beautiful imprisonment. This castle is not a prison. For you, perhaps not. For me, it has become exactly that. A gorgeous, powerful prison where I am expected to play a role that no longer fits the person I've become." Aldric moved away from the window, his agitation finally breaking through his controlled facade. "You speak as if our 3 centuries together meant nothing, as if everything we've built, everything we've shared, was somehow false or worthless." "Not worthless," Celeste said gently, "but perhaps not sustainable either. We built our immortal life on a foundation of shared trauma and mutual dependence. That's not the same as building it on love and choice. I chose you. Every night for 300 years, I chose you. You chose the version of me that supported your vision, that never questioned your decisions, that helped you avoid confronting grief through constant action and expansion. But that's not all of who I am. It's not even who I want to be anymore. The words struck him visibly. He sat heavily in the chair beside her fireplace, suddenly looking older than his immortal features should have allowed. I don't know how to be anything other than what I am, he admitted. The conquest, the strategic thinking, the constant vigilance, it's not just what I do, Celeste, it's who I am. Remove that, and what's left? Perhaps that's what you need to discover, she said, sitting across from him. Perhaps that's why this separation is necessary for both of us. You've never had to exist without the role of vampire lord, without the constant stimulation of managing an empire. Maybe you need to learn who you are beneath all that power and responsibility. And if what's beneath is nothing, if all this time I've been nothing more than accumulated habits and strategic responses to perceived threats, the vulnerability in his voice nearly broke her resolve. This was the man she had fallen in love with as a mortal, not the conquering immortal, but the human being capable of doubt and self-reflection. Then you'll build something new, she said. Something chosen rather than inherited from trauma. They sat in silence for a time, the weight of 3 centuries pressing down upon them. Outside, the castle continued its nightly routines, guards changing shifts, servants completing their duties, the machinery of empire functioning with practiced efficiency. It would all continue without her, she realized. Aldric was right that the realm would survive her departure. Whether their relationship would survive was another question entirely. There's something you should know, Aldric said finally, about the Southern campaign. Celeste waited. I've decided not to pursue it. Not because I agree with your reasoning, but because it seems pointless to conquer new territories when I can't even keep peace in my own chambers. The admission surprised her. That's not like you. No, it isn't. Nothing about these past weeks has been like me. You've changed me, Celeste, whether you intended to or not. Made me question assumptions I've held for centuries. And does that frighten you? Terrifies me, he admitted. But perhaps fear is preferable to the alternative, which is losing you entirely. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Celeste felt something in her chest tighten, not with doubt about her decision, but with grief for what they were losing. Whatever Aldric's faults, whatever fundamental incompatibilities had developed between them, she had loved him once with complete devotion. Some part of her would always love the man he had been before immortality hardened him into something she could no longer recognize as her partner. I have to go, she said softly. I have to try to find out who I am when I'm not defined by my relationship to you or my role in your empire. For 3 centuries, I've been Lady Celeste, vampire queen of the northern reaches. But I was someone else first, someone with her own dreams and desires and ways of being in the world. You were Lady Celeste of Rosehaven, Aldric said, daughter of Lord Edmund, known for your healing gardens and your kindness to servants. You read poetry and embroidered altar cloths for the village church. You dreamed of raising children and growing old, surrounded by grandchildren. The fact that he remembered surprised her. Yes, simple dreams, happy dreams. And you think you can return to that? After everything we've seen and done? I think I can try. I think I owe it to the woman I was to at least try. Aldric nodded slowly. And if the monastery doesn't provide what you're seeking? If you find that 3 centuries of immortality can't simply be set aside through religious contemplation, then I'll find another path. But I have to start somewhere, Aldric. I have to begin the journey back to myself, even if it means leaving me behind. even then. The finality in her voice seemed to settle over him like a shroud. For a moment, she thought he might try again to dissuade her, might offer some compromise that would allow them to find a middle path between his vision and hers. Instead, he stood and moved toward the door. "I won't try to stop you," he said without turning around, "and I won't send anyone after you when you leave. Whatever choice you make at the monastery, whether to stay or return, it will be yours alone. Thank you." He paused with his hand on the door handle. "But Celeste, I want you to know that no matter what happens, no matter how you choose to live the rest of your existence, these 3 centuries with you have been the best part of my immortal life. Even if they end tomorrow night." Then he was gone, leaving her alone with her preparations and the weight of everything that would change when she walked away from Ravencrest Keep. The travel cloak seemed to watch her from the bed, patient and understanding. Tomorrow night, it would carry her toward an uncertain future. But for the first time in centuries, uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. She was ready to discover what that might mean. The dawn's light crystal pulsed with inner fire as Celeste lifted it from its velvet-lined case, its faceted surface catching the candlelight and throwing rainbows across her chamber walls. This artifact was perhaps the most precious thing she owned, a rare magical stone that allowed vampires to walk briefly in natural sunlight without burning. She had acquired it decades ago from a traveling mystic, thinking it might serve some strategic purpose. Instead, it had remained locked away, unused, as she had forgotten what it meant to long for daylight. Now, as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky, she understood its true purpose. The castle slept around her in the deep silence that marked the vampire rest period. Even the mortal servants had retired to their quarters, leaving the ancient halls empty save for the guards who maintained their posts out of duty rather than supernatural necessity. Celeste moved through the corridors like a ghost of herself, her simple brown traveling dress and worn cloak marking her as a different creature entirely from the elegant vampire queen who had ruled these halls for 3 centuries. She paused at the great doors that led to the main courtyard, her hand trembling slightly as she pressed against the heavy wood. Beyond lay the world she had known only in darkness for so long, a realm of perpetual night where she moved as predator rather than participant in the natural order. The crystal in her hand promised something else. The possibility of experiencing creation as it was meant to be experienced, under the light that gave life to all growing things. The doors opened silently on well-oiled hinges, and Celeste stepped into the pre-dawn air. Her horse waited where she had arranged, a gentle mare named Starlight, who had served faithfully in the castle stables for years. The animal nickered softly in greeting, as if understanding the significance of this moment. But before she could reach the horse, footsteps echoed across the courtyard stones. "Did you truly think I would let you leave without saying goodbye?" Aldric emerged from the shadows near the gate, no longer the composed ruler she had spoken with the night before. His dark hair was disheveled, his clothes hastily thrown on, his eyes wild with an emotion she had not seen in decades, genuine fear. "You said you wouldn't stop me," she reminded him, though her voice was gentler than the words might have suggested. "I said I wouldn't send anyone after you. I said nothing about letting you leave without telling you what I should have said centuries ago." He moved closer, but stopped several paces away, as if afraid that coming nearer might shatter something fragile between them. "I failed you," he said simply, "not just recently, but from the very beginning of our immortal existence. I convinced myself that choosing vampirism for us was wisdom, that building an empire was healing, that conquest could somehow justify the loss of our children. But the truth is, I was a coward." Celeste felt something crack inside her chest. "Aldric, no, let me finish. I was too weak to face grief properly, too terrified of emotional pain to let myself heal naturally. So I ran from it into immortality, and I dragged you with me because I couldn't bear the thought of facing eternity alone." I turned you into an accomplice in my own avoidance of human feeling. The words hung in the morning air between them, stark with honesty. I turned you into someone you were never meant to be, he continued. And then I convinced myself that this transformed version was an improvement rather than a diminishment. I made you into my perfect partner for an immortal existence you never wanted, and I called it love. Celeste felt tears on her cheeks, the first she had shed in his presence for decades. I did love you. I do love you. But I love the man you were before grief hardened you into something that could never be satisfied with simple happiness. And I love you enough now to let you go find that happiness, even if it means I'll never see you again. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small object, her wedding ring from their mortal ceremony. The simple gold band she had worn as a human bride before vampiric transformation had replaced it with the ornate symbol of their immortal bond. I kept this, he said, holding it out to her. All these years, I kept it hidden away because it reminded me of who we used to be. I thought that was weakness, dwelling on mortality when we had transcended it. But you're right, we didn't transcend anything. We just ran from it. Celeste took the ring with shaking hands, feeling the weight of the promises it represented, vows made by two young people who had believed love alone would be enough to carry them through any hardship. What will you do? She asked. I don't know, he admitted. Learn to exist without the constant distraction of expansion, perhaps. Try to remember who I was before I became what I thought I needed to be. Maybe even learn to grieve properly. Finally. And the realm, your responsibilities, will continue with Marcus's guidance and the Council's wisdom. Perhaps what our people need is not an immortal emperor, but something more human in its approach to governance. The eastern sky was growing lighter, painting the mountains with soft gold and rose. Celeste felt the crystal's power responding to the approaching dawn, warming in her palm with gentle promise. I have to go, she said. If I'm going to experience sunrise as a mortal would, it has to be now, before I lose my nerve. Aldric nodded, stepping back to give her space. I won't forget you, Celeste. Whatever name you take at the monastery, whatever life you build there, I'll remember the woman who loved me enough to show me the truth about myself, even when it meant losing everything we had, built together. And I'll remember the man who loved me enough to let me choose myself over him. She mounted starlight quickly, before the weight of 3 centuries could drag her back down into familiar patterns. The crystal pulsed brighter as the sun climbed higher, its magic preparing to shield her from the supernatural vulnerability that had kept her in darkness for so long. Goodbye, Aldric. Goodbye, beloved. The seal of abdication felt impossibly heavy in Celeste's hand as she drew it from her finger for the final time. The ancient ring bore the crest of their joined houses, the raven of Thornwick intertwined with the rose of Rosehaven, symbols that had marked their mortal union and later their immortal reign. Removing it was more than a symbolic gesture. It was the formal end of 3 centuries of shared power, the dissolution of everything they had built together. Aldric watched the ring slide free with an expression of profound loss, as if witnessing the death of something sacred. In many ways, he was. The vampire queen who had stood beside him through countless battles and political struggles was choosing to cease existing, leaving behind only the woman she had been before duty and immortality had reshaped her into someone else. I won't fight for you anymore, Celeste said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the words. She had rehearsed them during the long nights of preparation, knowing that this moment would require absolute clarity. Not for your vision of empire, not for your need to transform grief into conquest, not for the immortal legacy you believe we're building together. The words struck Aldric like physical blows. For 300 years, she had been his perfect complement, strong when he needed strength, wise when he sought counsel, ruthless when their enemies required elimination. Her decision to stop fighting alongside him meant more than the end of their marriage. It meant the end of the only partnership he had ever known that felt like completion rather than compromise. "I understand," he said, though his voice carried the weight of everything he was losing. "And I won't try to make you stay through guilt or obligation or appeals to duty. If you've found the courage to choose yourself over everything else we've built, then I must find the courage to let you go." Celeste felt something shift inside her chest, not doubt about her decision, but a profound sadness for what they were ending. Whatever his faults, whatever fundamental differences had grown between them, Aldric had been the great love of her mortal life. Some part of her would always mourn the loss of what they might have become if grief hadn't twisted them into something harder and colder than love could sustain. The dawn's light crystal pulsed brighter as the sun climbed higher over the mountains, its magic creating a protective aura around her that would allow her to experience natural daylight without the burning that normally threatened vampires. She could feel the warmth building, promising the kind of sensory experience she had not known for centuries. "This doesn't have to be the end of everything," Aldric said suddenly, his voice carrying a desperate edge. "You could visit, send word of how you fare, perhaps in time, when you've found what you're seeking." "No," Celeste said gently but firmly. "Clean breaks heal better than ones that are constantly reopened. If I'm to discover who I am, apart from you, apart from this life we've built, it must be a complete separation. Anything less would be unfair to both of us." She dismounted from Starlight and walked to where he stood, close enough to see the pain in his dark eyes, close enough to touch if she chose. Instead, she held out the seal of abdication, its weight representing everything she was relinquishing. "I'm no longer the queen of anything," she said. "I'm just Celeste again, or perhaps I'm someone new entirely. Someone who chooses peace over power, healing over conquest, authenticity over perfect partnership." Aldric took the ring with hands that trembled slightly, as if touching something that might crumble at any moment. "And if you discover that the woman you're seeking doesn't exist, if 3 centuries of immortality has changed you too fundamentally to ever return to mortal contentment, then I'll face that truth honestly instead of running from it into endless distraction," she replied. "But I have to try, Aldric. I have to know if there's still something human left inside what we've become." The sun crested the mountain peaks fully now, sending golden light streaming across the castle courtyard. The dawn's light crystal flared with responsive magic, surrounding Celeste in a gentle radiance that made her appear almost ethereal, caught between the supernatural creature she had been and the mortal woman she hoped to become again. "Look," she whispered, turning her face toward the sunrise. "When did you last see morning light? When did you last feel the sun's warmth on your skin?" Aldric followed her gaze, wincing slightly as the light struck his unprotected features. For vampires, sunrise marked the retreat into darkness, the end of their active existence until night fell again. But Celeste stood in full daylight without pain, the crystal's magic allowing her to experience what they had given up when they chose immortality. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "I had forgotten how beautiful the world looks when it's not seen through the lens of predator and prey, when you can simply exist as part of creation rather than standing apart from it." "You're beautiful," Aldric said, watching the way the sunlight caught in her hair, turned her skin golden with warmth. "More beautiful now than I've seen you in decades. This choice, difficult as it is for me to accept, has given you something I never could." "What's that?" "Joy," he said simply. "Simple, uncomplicated joy in being alive." Celeste smiled then, the first completely unguarded expression he had seen from her in years. It transformed her face, made her look younger despite the centuries that lay between them and their mortal beginning. "Goodbye, Aldric," she said, mounting Starlight again. "Rule wisely. Find peace when you can. And remember, sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. "I'll remember," he promised, stepping back as she guided her horse toward the castle gates. "I love you enough to let you choose happiness over duty, even if it destroys me." The gates opened before her, revealing the road that led away from everything she had ever known toward an uncertain but freely chosen future. She did not look back. The prayer book of solace rested on the simple wooden desk in Celeste's monastery cell, its worn leather binding and dog-eared pages, speaking of countless hands that had sought comfort within its verses. She had carried it with her from Ravencrest Keep, one of the few possessions she had brought from her former life, not as reminder of what she had left behind, but as symbol of what she hoped to find. Genuine peace after centuries of conflict, both external and internal. 3 months had passed since she had ridden away from the castle gates toward an uncertain future. The transformation had not been easy. Learning to live as a mortal again after 3 centuries of supernatural existence required more adjustment than she had anticipated. The loss of vampiric strength and speed had been manageable, but learning to sleep at night rather than during the day, to eat simple food rather than sustain herself on blood, to age naturally rather than exist in frozen perfection. These changes had challenged her in ways she had not expected, but she had persevered, and more importantly, she had begun to heal. The routine of monastic life suited her better than she had imagined possible. Morning prayers at dawn, tending the monastery gardens, copying religious manuscripts in the scriptorium, evening meditation in the chapel, these simple activities provided structure without the constant pressure of strategic thinking and political maneuvering that had defined her immortal existence. Mother Superior Catherine had proven to be a wise and gentle guide, asking few questions about Celeste's past while offering profound insights into the process of spiritual recovery. Grief, she had explained during one of their early conversations, is not a problem to be solved, but a landscape to be traveled. The goal is not to escape it, but to learn to walk through it with grace. For the first time in centuries, Celeste was learning to do exactly that. She could think of her children now, Emma and William, without the overwhelming anguish that had once made their memory unbearable. The pain remained, would always remain, but it had transformed from a wound that refused to heal into something more like a scar that ached, with changes in weather but no longer threatened to destroy her. She could remember their laughter, their curiosity, their small hands in hers, and feel gratitude for the time they had shared, rather than only rage at its brevity. This morning, as she worked in the herb garden that had become her special charge, she found herself humming a lullaby she had once sung to them. The memory brought tears, but they were clean tears, the kind that washed rather than corroded. "Sister Margaret tells me you've worked magic with these plants," Brother Francis observed, approaching through the rows of lavender and rosemary that Celeste had coaxed into abundant growth. The elderly monk served as the monastery's gardener and had become her closest friend among the religious community. "No magic," Celeste replied, brushing dirt from her hands. "Just patience and attention. Plants respond well to being truly seen and cared for rather than simply managed. A lesson applicable to more than gardening, I suspect." She smiled at his gentle wisdom. "Indeed." Brother Francis studied her face with the kindly perception that marked his nature. "You seem different today, more settled somehow." Celeste considered this observation. "I received a letter yesterday," she admitted. "The first communication from my former life since I arrived here." "Troubling news?" "No, actually surprisingly good news. The man I left behind, has made changes of his own. He stepped back from military campaigns, focused on peaceful governance, even established programs to help veterans of his various wars transition to civilian life." She paused, touching the prayer book's worn cover. "It seems that my leaving forced him to examine his own choices in ways he might never have done otherwise. And how does that knowledge affect you?" "It brings me joy," she said, surprising herself with the simple honesty of the statement. Not because I hope for reconciliation, that chapter of my life is closed, but because it means the man I once loved has found his own path toward healing. We couldn't heal together, but perhaps we could heal separately. A bell chimed across the valley, calling the community to midday prayers. Celeste gathered her gardening tools, preparing to join the familiar rhythm of worship that had become so much more meaningful than the elaborate ceremonies of her vampire court. "Sister Celeste?" Brother Francis called as she started toward the chapel. She had grown accustomed to her new name, the simple identity that carried no weight of title or obligation beyond her own spiritual development. "There's something I've wanted to say to you," the old monk continued. "When you first arrived, I saw a woman carrying great sorrow, someone who had forgotten how to exist without the burden of others' expectations. But today, watching you in the garden, listening to you speak of your former life with such peaceful acceptance, today I see someone who has remembered how to simply be herself." The observation touched something deep in her heart. "Thank you, brother. That may be the greatest compliment anyone has ever given me." As she walked toward the chapel, Celeste reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place. The woman who had ridden away from Ravencrest Keep had been desperate and uncertain, fleeing from a life that no longer fit, but unclear what might replace it. The woman who knelt now in the monastery chapel was still finding her way, but she was finding it on her own terms, according to her own understanding of what constituted a life worth living. The afternoon sun streamed through the chapel's simple windows, painting the stone walls with patterns of light and shadow. Celeste opened her prayer book and began to read, not from obligation or ceremony, but from genuine desire for the peace and wisdom contained within its verses. Somewhere beyond the mountains, Aldric was learning his own lessons about governance and healing. Somewhere in the world, other souls struggled with their own journeys toward authenticity and peace. But here, in this quiet sanctuary, she was exactly where she needed to be, no longer defined by her relationship to anyone else, but simply Celeste, a woman seeking and finding her own way home to herself. For the first time in 3.5 centuries, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.